I am Raphael, your host, and this is the Deep Seed Podcast. Regenerative agriculture is going to be a central topic to this podcast. And before we get into too much detail in later episodes, I would like to better understand the basic concepts. What is regenerative agriculture and how does it differ from conventional agriculture? What are its key principles and related farming practices? And how do they impact the health of soils and the ecosystems around them? To discuss this, I'm today at Hyde Farm in Maidenhead, just west of London, in company of Andrew Randall. Andrew, hello, and thank you so much for having me here and being one of the first guests in this podcast.
No, thank you. Thank you for asking me to be involved. It's a pleasure to talk about these topics.
Could you start by introducing yourself, but without talking about your profession just yet?
Okay, so I'm Andrew Randall. I'm 47. I live in the southeast of the United Kingdom, so just near a town called Maidenhead. We're about 30 miles west of London. My family life, I'm married to my wife Jenny. I have two children, George and Isla, and passionate about farming. In my spare time, I enjoy motorsports and other country pursuits.
And could you tell us about your journey as a farmer?
As a farmer, so I suppose it all started back in my childhood. I'm very lucky to be born into a farming family. And so I'm the third generation to be involved in this business. So from a very early age, I enjoyed getting involved in the farm and helping my father. And at that time we had cows as well as crops, and so quite a lot of my youth was spent helping with the livestock. I then got as much experience as possible on farms of my relations, learning about sheep and lambing and local farms where I helped out with turkeys and things like that. After I finished school, I had a year out travelling and I looked at farming in other parts of the world and did some work in both Australia on a dairy farm and New Zealand on mixed livestock farms and arable farms, just trying to build up my experience all the time. When I finished that year, I then went to university in Newcastle in the northeast of England. And I studied a degree in agriculture with farm business management. So that was 3 years, and then I left there and got my first job up in Scotland, which was managing an estate which had dairy cows, sheep, and arable cropping as well. And I was there for almost 6 years before I came back down to join the family business, and that was back in 2005. So I've been here now almost 20 years, being involved here alongside my father, and then sort of increasingly taking over to where I am today, sort of running the whole business.
And where we are today, it's your farm, Hyde Farm.
Yeah.
Could you maybe give us a little overview of your operation?
Sure. So at our core is a farming business based around arable cropping. But I should sort of mention the rest of the business. So we view ourselves as a rural business, and my job really is to make the most of all of our rural assets. So at the core is very much arable farming. I mentioned we had a history of dairy farming, and if you go back long enough, we had a milk round serving milk to the local towns. But yes, for the last 20 years, 25 years almost, it's just been arable crops. We have some renewable energy. We have some residential property letting. We have some commercial property letting. And in terms of the sort of non-farmed area, we're just constantly looking at other ways to derive income from the land, sort of hiring it out for events, or we have a model aeroplane club flying planes here, and we have phone masts, and just anything really, just to make the most of our assets. So my time is probably spent about half farming and half managing the rest of the business.
Right. So you've been diversifying your income sources a lot. Is that like economic necessity? Is it?
Partly, yes. Yeah. I suppose that's the main driver, indeed. Yeah. We're not huge, so we don't have brilliant economies of scale. Our arable operation now covers about 320 hectares, which is sort of just about enough to justify doing it ourselves and investing in our own equipment, etc. But partly because of where we are, we do have lots of other opportunities. We are very accessible. There's a good road network near us, and we have a big population being so close to London, and the fact that just most of the UK is heavily populated, but even more so down here in the southeast of the country. So then we have good demand for example, for the property letting and trying to do other bits and pieces. So it just makes good business sense in terms of the longevity of our business, and third generation, absolutely looking to pass it on to my children and hopefully them to theirs. And so the more we can grow and improve what we're doing, the better.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier you had children. Is it your wish that they take over the farm one day?
My main focus is just to give them that opportunity to do so. There's no expectation necessarily. But hopefully that at some point, preferably after they've been away to explore and try other things, they will like the idea of coming back and taking over an element of the business, but whether it's the pure farming or whether it's some of the other things, who knows? But they're both quite keen. Their age, my son George is 13 and Isla is 10, and George inevitably is a enthusiastic young boy, just like I was, who loves the machinery and the tractors and the driving and all that sort of thing. So that's a great start. And he's had some livestock of his own. He keeps sheep and pigs. So that's all good. And Isla's sort of latching onto it as well. So yeah, we'll watch this space.
On your website, there's a tagline that says, "Healthy soil equals healthy plants equals healthy animals equals healthy food equals healthy people equals healthy planet." Could you tell us what this means?
I can't remember where I stole that tagline, but it just resonated, and I maybe added a little bit to it. But it's very logically based, I think, in terms of we know as human beings, the healthier we are, the more we thrive. And so it's really the same in terms of if our farming system. If we make sure that every piece of it is optimized, then we're probably going to get the best results. So we very much start with focusing on getting our soil as healthy as possible. That in turn means that the plants are going to thrive. They're going to be more resilient to pests and diseases. They're going to provide the nutrition, for example, to grazing animals, which in turn are going to produce meat, which should be as good as possible, and so on and so forth. So then the people eat this quality food, this nutrient-dense food, and hopefully that culminates in a thriving population and as healthy a planet as possible.
Right. And I noticed that the soil health is really at the start of this chain of equals, and so if the soil health isn't there, then the whole rest of the chain falls apart.
Indeed. Yes, no, it is fundamental to, I suppose it's fundamental to life on Earth, really. If we don't have soil that can sustain plant and consequently animal life, then we're going to be struggling. And I suppose we've seen that in certain areas of the world where things have gone off the rails and the balance has been upset, and the capacity to produce food and sustain life has been severely compromised. But we seem to have latched on to where we've gone wrong, and lessons have been learnt. And it's great to see and be part of this sort of resurgent movement to counteract any damage that's been done and hopefully move things forward. At one point it was all about sustainability, and now it's sort of gone to the next level of trying to be regenerational to actually build and improve things, which has to be the right way forward.
How do you define soil health, and how do you measure it?
We have to look at what a soil is meant to do, and so a healthy soil is going to be well structured, have particles that are able to latch on and keep hold of nutrients, and have a sort of symbiotic relationship with the plants that are growing within them. They're going to retain moisture, which is crucial, especially in our part of the world where we suffer from lack of rainfall periodically. And they're going to hold nutrients and minimize runoff and minimize pollution, with nutrients going back into rivers and watercourses and back into the sea, and all the pollution incidents that can cause. And generally hosting a good sort of community of all the different organisms which play an important role in its health and consequently plant health.
One of the leading figures of the regenerative movement is an American farmer called Gabe Brown, and I read his book Dirt to Soil, which is a real goldmine of information about regenerative farming. In his book, he identifies 6 key principles, and since I would like this episode to be an introduction to regenerative agriculture for people who are new to this topic, I thought it would be a good idea to structure the conversation around those 6 key principles and go through them one by one. The first principle is to avoid as much as possible mechanical disturbance. In other words, tillage.
Yes. So tillage, or other people might know it as cultivations, and traditionally would be associated with implements like ploughs and tyne cultivators or disc cultivators. And it's ordinarily involved engaging the metal into the soil to probably to a depth of up to 10 inches or so. And the benefits of that have been in incorporating the previous year's residue, in perhaps killing and burying weed seeds to a depth where they struggle to grow during the next growing season, so they don't compete with the crop. It's also created a tilth, just the smaller soil particles, which can settle around the seed to create the sort of vital seed-to-soil contact for that seed to germinate and thrive. It's historically been, one of the only ways really to begin the plant growth process, particularly historically in the absence of chemicals that, for example, could kill the weeds to avoid the competition. Whereas more recently, we do have that tool in our armory. We have been able to use chemical control of weeds, and so that removes one element of having to cultivate or use tillage systems.
Sorry, but it seems to be very useful, and it has a lot of benefits, and most farmers around the world do this. So why are regenerative farmers saying more and more that tilling is problematic for soil health?
So there's just a much greater understanding of the soil's requirements in order for it to thrive. So, for example, we have a much bigger appreciation of worms and the role that they play in recycling nutrients, creating massive drainage channels, soil and nutrients through the profile. And not dissimilarly, plant roots themselves are obviously creating channels where the root grows to translocate moisture and nutrients from the soil to the plant. And so they are growing annually, let's say, and producing a channel through the soil. And so if you then imagine that you're going in with a big tractor and a cultivator, and you're just bursting the soil wide open. And so you're immediately removing all these lovely channels that the worms and the plant roots have created, which, seems on the face of it a massive waste, because, they've spent a year creating these useful systems, and then they're just sort of obliterated and everything's reset. Not only that, but the nature of bursting it open is burning carbon and releasing carbon dioxide, and effectively, unnecessarily burning organic matter, which is, very key to soil health and the nutrient cycle, etc. So that's why we are looking to move away from disturbing the soil as much as we can.
So if I understand correctly, it has a lot of very interesting short-term benefits when trying to grow a crop, but it has a lot of issues, especially in the long term, in terms of building the health of the soil and the amount of carbon in the soil and the microbiology in the soil and the macrobiology, the worms and so on. So it's kind of a trade-off between short-term gain and long-term resilience and fertility.
That's a very good summary. One of the most obvious short-term gains is you mineralize some nitrogen, so it always looks like you've got a lovely, healthy crop when you've used cultivations. But in actual fact, that's a sort of fairly short-lived symptom, which we can cope without, and it's better to be think more long-term and not and wean ourselves off that system.
So, if the idea is to over time reduce your dependence on tillage, but you still need to make sure that you have a productive crop during that transition, how do you go about that?
So it probably really comes back to the main characteristics of soil health and creating an environment which is as healthy as possible before you start withdrawing these artificial methods of managing some of those characteristics. Historically, you would use cultivation for drainage and things like that. Whereas if you are careful in the years leading up to you removing, the direct processes of cultivation, then hopefully the soil has had time to build up a resilience, build up the worm channels, build up the root channels, and just be in a much better state to cope when you're not cultivating it. Hopefully sort of leaving organic matter on the top, and that being recycled begins to create a healthier upper layer with a good crumb structure, and more than adequate for you to put a slot in with a direct drill to plant the seed, etc. And then in the knowledge that you've already got these worm channels and these root channels below it, it should cope with excess rain and things like that, and the system just begins to evolve and get going. And I think some soils are more difficult to start the process on, perhaps those which lack natural structure. But it's not impossible, and it's been proven time and again that you can pretty much do it on most soils, and happily that's what we found here.
And what has been your personal experience with this?
So we began experimenting in 2009, 2010, and we hired a couple of different drills, and we used them on areas where we knew the soil health was quite good, the structure was good, and it wasn't all perfect, but there were a few downfalls, but we learnt what they were. And then in 2011, we invested in both a disc drill and a tyne drill, and we basically stopped cultivating overnight, effectively.
Could you just quickly explain what these two types of drills are?
Sure. Well, so a disc drill would be traditionally what you would associate with no-till farming. It is very low disturbance, and it is literally cutting a slot in the soil. So for a sort of a conventional cereal grain, it'll be about 1.5 to 2 inches deep, and it's placing the seed in, and then a following wheel will just sort of fold, almost zip it back up. So if set up correctly, you might have difficulty in seeing that the field has been planted, that it's been drilled, which is the sort of holy grail. That's what you want. You know that you haven't, upset those drainage channels. You haven't burst open the soil and released any carbon dioxide. You haven't, almost as importantly, disturbed soil and disturbed weed seeds that are going to start growing at the same time that your intended crop is starting to grow. So it's got a lot going for it. The alternative to a disc is a tyne. So instead of your round disc, it is just a more or less vertical piece of metal that is creating a slot in the soil. Just by its nature being pulled through, it's going to be slightly more disruptive and burst the soil open more and create more disturbance. But if set up correctly, can still be a very valid way of establishing a crop without cultivation and minimizing all those negative impacts. So we have both, which is a little bit of a luxury. But the advantage, they both have their advantages. A disc is far better at planting in into other crops, for example, upright crops. We're planting them into a cover crop, a green crop that the disc can cut through. Then that works really, really well. However, at least half of our rotation involves planting into heavy residue of chopped straw, oilseed rape, canola, and bean haulm, and we need to push that trash out the way, particularly the white straw from cereal crops. So the tyne goes through, makes a path, pushes the residue to the side, plants the seed into pure soil rather than a mixture of soil and straw, and it just gives it a much better chance of germinating and establishing strongly without the impact of compromised seed-to-soil contact or the compromises of residues from the rotting straw impacting the root zone.
The second principle is to avoid as much as possible chemical disturbance. In other words, avoiding the use of synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and so on. And farmers obviously use these chemicals to improve their productivity. So what is the problem?
Well, the problem is it's quite hard to do without them. And the industry has benefited from the sort of industrial revolution and improvements in the availability of products, both sort of artificial fertilizers and pesticides. And we've had good sustainable businesses off the back of them. But we've reached a point where it's gone a bit too far, and A, they're very expensive, and B, we recognise that we're probably creating some of our own problems. So if you're applying too much nitrogen, you're getting lots of lush growth. That lush growth is more susceptible to fungal attack or even pest attack, aphid attack, etc. And so we want to scale it back as much as we can. And it's not the sort of direct effects on the plant, it's the interactions within the soil itself, and it's just sort of upsetting the balance. So we are beginning to scale back. We are self-confessed conventional farmers. We're not organic or anything like that. We would really struggle to do our system in an organic, as in pesticide-free way. The biggest stumbling block would be the lack of glyphosate use, which is a key element of how we control our weeds. And so instead we sort of try and minimize the disadvantages of using those chemicals by supplementing those sprays with extra sugars and things like that, so that the impact on the soil biology isn't quite as great as it might have been if we just ignored the problem.
Is there a world in a few years' time where it's actually possible to have a successful farming operation without tilling and without using any chemicals, or do you find it impossible?
I'm not saying it can't be done, and there's some amazing pioneers out there who I try and keep an eye on as best I can, who really are sort of pushing the boundaries and making things work. I don't know quite how consistently and how consistently economically that is. We've got a lot more work to do before we can get anywhere near that. As I said, one of the biggest stumbling blocks is perhaps the inability to control weeds, but we're seeing more and more technology which potentially can help us with that, and robotic mechanical weeders that are accurate enough to consider the idea that it might be possible longer term. So never say never, and I think it's probably where we need to be trying to get to.
The third and fourth principle, in my view, are directly related. One is to never let the soil bare, and the other is to always have a living root in the soil. What can you tell us about this? How do you cover the soil and why?
So I sometimes think about our farm as a big solar panel, really. It's its job really is to intercept sunlight to grow plants. And so in this part of the world, we haven't got the climate to be producing 2 cash crops a year, which you might get away with in a warmer, wetter climate. And so we're only really planting and harvesting one cash crop. And so, for example, we have a rotation of wheat followed by canola, followed by wheat, followed by spring oats, followed by another crop of wheat, and then eventually, lastly, in the 6th year, it's spring beans. So for the wheat, we plant it in October, we harvest it in August, and there's normally a small window before we plant the next crop, and so it might be 4 or 5 weeks, which just isn't enough time to justify planting a cover crop, and so we don't. But where we're planting a spring crop afterwards, we plant a cover crop. So as soon as the combine leaves the field, we go in with a drill again and plant a crop, which is purely there it'll never see a combine. It won't be harvested in the conventional sense.
Sorry, what's a combine?
A combine harvester for gathering the crop in. So 2 years in 6, we can justify planting a cover crop. And so in front of the oats, we plant a mixture of species, which are things like peas, sunflowers, linseed, buckwheat, and 1 or 2 other things. And the idea is that they have different characteristics in terms of their growth habits. So some of them have long roots, some of them have sort of flowery, shallow roots, which are great for creating soil tilth, whilst the longer ones are sort of good at breaking up any compaction and going a bit deeper for nutrients and moisture. And they have different heights above ground, so you've got a sort of full canopy. And in a good year, like or in a mild autumn like we just had, then a lot of them will flower and provide a sort of good habitat for pollinators. And all the while, they are harvesting all the sunlight that would otherwise just fall on bare ground, and they're capturing and holding a huge amount of nutrients as well. So, in our experiments, we've harvested, for example, 1 meter square of the above ground biomass, and analysed that to see how much nitrogen and particularly potash it's holding, and it really does capture and hold an enormous amount of ingredients, to the extent that we're becoming more and more confident about scaling back the inputs that we put on the following crops in the spring, because we know that they've held on to it. It hasn't washed out the soil into the rivers, and it should be there on the whole to feed into the next crop.
Right, so it's capturing all of this nutrition, it's using sunlight, it's protecting the ground.
Yeah.
And so when you come in to plant your cash crop in spring, there's more nutrition and soil is in better state and better structure.
Exactly that. You imagine if you didn't have a crop growing and there's nothing sort of supporting it, all the winter rainfall would just sort of compact the ground, and it would just sort of slump, and the air would start to go out of it, and it'd just be lifeless. You're not sort of giving the worms and all the other microorganisms food. The roots aren't, or the plants aren't photosynthesizing, and the roots aren't exuding all the goodness that comes from that. And so the whole system sort of grinds to a halt, which is just a wasted opportunity, really. We're constantly trying to improve our soil, and so if we have blank periods, then we're going backwards, really.
I actually heard someone use a metaphor in a podcast I listened to recently, and to be fair, I don't remember who said that, but they said it's like having property in London and not renting it out for 5 months out of the year.
Yeah.
It sounds like a missed opportunity. So why are so many farmers not doing it?
I suppose it depends on your cropping setup. Before we went to this more diverse crop rotation of a 6-year rotation, we were just growing 2 years of wheat and then oilseed rape, and they were all planted in the winter. And so on the whole, I suppose, they were kind of their own cover crop, but they were monocultures, they were single crops. They didn't have the diversity that we put into our cover crops with those different root lengths and different plant characteristics. So I don't know. Part of it is educating people to see the benefits. They're not cost-free. The seed is quite expensive and becoming more expensive as more people are doing it, and the industry is sort of latching on to trying to get value out of it and increasing margins on the seed, for example. You've obviously got the cost of planting it. But, we, through our own experiments and calculations, are confident that it's worth it. And so there's no reason not to. And there's increasingly more incentives to do it with government payments meant to be coming in this year for that kind of thing. And also we are now finding it's having an impact on our carbon payments, which we'll probably come on to.
Yes. And do you harvest your own seeds? Isn't there a business opportunity there to harvest seeds and to sell them if they're so valuable?
Probably, yes. We've done a bit of the species that we can confidently grow. Some of them are a bit more specialist, and in reality, by the time we've attempted to do it and cleaned it up without, if you produce a sort of weedy seed crop with other foreign seed in it, it's probably going to end up in more trouble than it's worth. And so it's sort of recognizing your strengths and playing to them. But yes, there's certainly corners to be cut and advantages to be had if you think about it hard enough. Yeah.
Right. So just to kind of recap this whole covering the soil and having a living root in the soil topic, covering it up, the goal is to protect it from rainfall, from the elements.
Indeed, it's not just planting a cover crop; it's also what you're doing with the residues from the previous crop that you've harvested. And so we no longer bale the straw and take it off the field. It's all chopped at the back of the combine harvester and spread out across the full width of the field to create a layer of mulch, effectively.
Okay, so the residue used to remove it outside of the field.
We used to remove it and either sell it or use it in our historical livestock enterprise for either animal feed or animal bedding. And then, yes, by and large, it would have effectively been recycled, turned into farmyard manure, and then it would have come back and been spread on the field. But in the absence of an adequate livestock enterprise, we still see the benefit in just leaving it there. But the important thing is leaving it on the surface. If we happen to chop the straw in the past when we were still using cultivation and then you plough it under, the danger is you're sort of ploughing it under to about 8 inches into a sort of fairly anaerobic environment where it became very hard for it to be broken down, and quite often you would go back and plough it up the following year, and yes, it would look slightly discoloured and everything, but it hadn't changed a lot, and so you hadn't gained any real benefit from it. Whereas if we leave it on the top, this is where the worms do a fantastic job, and they're fascinating to watch. That you can see them coming up. They sort of circle round the residue and begin pulling it back into their burrows, where they begin the recycling process, and that keeps all that goodness sort of in the right part of the soil profile. And until they've achieved that whole process, I suppose it's also, whilst your cover crop is establishing and getting going and creating a canopy, until that happens, your soil's still quite vulnerable to heavy rainfall events. And so if you've got a nice cover of straw, a mat of and a mulch of straw, then it's going to take away the intensity of heavy rainfall, bouncing off the surface and compacting that surface layer, for example. And what else does it do? It insulates it a bit. It sort of regulates the temperature a bit better. So it can be a pain at times because sometimes you've got so much residue, which outwardly is a good thing because it's organic matter going back into the soil. But if you're out there trying to plant your next crop and you've got so much that it's just bulldozing up in front, it can get very frustrating. But it's all about managing the process from the harvesting operation forwards and just being mindful of what you're trying to achieve through the whole season.
The fifth principle is to increase diversity. Gabe Brown in the book says, the vast majority of producers focus only on the potential profit a particular crop may bring them that year. They do not look at the ecological capital that diversity builds. Why is diversity so important to the health of soils and ecosystems?
It's about balance, really, isn't it? It's which is why we're starting to think harder about the multi-species cover crops, the planting 2 crops at once, which might have different advantages and symbiotic effects.
So you do that sometimes, planting 2 crops at once?
We're just starting to experiment. So we are probably behind the curve. Where I see a lot of people being quite adventurous in that light. All we've done to date is plant extra crops alongside our canola, just to try and discourage the problems that we have with an insect called flea beetle, and it just sort of helps distract them a little bit. We principally used a species called buckwheat, but we've also used some clover, which, for example, is a legume and can fix nitrogen, which in turn, should have a good knock-on effect to the growing cash crop, the canola. So, there's lots of things to look at there, but we're not as yet. All of those would have been killed before harvest, so we're not ever taking 2 crops off the field at once and then 2 seeds in the same harvesting operation. We haven't got that far. People are, and they're coming up with very clever ways of separating them when they get them back into the shed. And I think on the whole they're seeing that as much as you're getting reduced yields, their combined yield is greater than you would have got from your monocrop. So it's potentially something we all ought to be looking at.
Any plans for trying new experiments in terms of bringing extra diversity?
Yes, yeah. There's probably a lot to be had from the legumes and the free nitrogen that they can provide, and so we need to be exploring more with them with a variety of crops. I mean, one of the things a lot of people talk about is having a permanent clover understory, and being able to manage that and plant into it, and using things like inter-row mowers to keep on top of the clover and allow the cash crop to compete adequately. At the end of the day, I suppose a lot of it comes down to profitability, and the main legume that we grow, well, the only one we grow as a cash crop is the field beans, which fix their own nitrogen. I suppose you see them more frequently in proper organic farming, where they are recognised as being a fantastic fertility builder, where you might have 2 or 3 years of a grass clover lay, and then and that'll be utilised presumably by livestock, and you will have an income from that livestock before you then plant your cereal crops, for example, to really capitalise on what's been built up over the last 3 years. But and there are other options coming in now, whereby some of the government incentivised schemes are allowing you to plant these legume lays, and which will definitely help justify them, because without that support, it was hard to actually get a true income out of that year, and it was probably not enough of a benefit in the following year to make it stack up economically.
When you say allow, I mean, are they actually helping financially? Or
yes, yeah. It's an option within some of the environmental schemes that have been introduced in recent years, and increasingly so. It looks like they are sort of heading more down that route.
What do you think about those recent schemes? Do you think that the government is going in the right direction in incentivizing farmers to change their practices?
So we've been doing various environmental schemes, government-backed environmental schemes, for the last 15 years or more, and they've been very specific in terms of separate to the crops that we grow. It's been providing grass and flower margins down the edge of fields, and planting crops to produce seed for small birds in the winter, things like that, which have worked well with our system. And they will have had an impact on our main field areas, courtesy of where they've been positioned, and for example, pollinators in the flower margins going into the field, and beneficial predators taking out aphids and things like that. But the big change in the last couple of years has been more focused on how to really integrate beneficial sort of environmental practices into the arable system itself. And so we were in a scheme last year which did pay us some money to plant cover crops and things like that, and just be far more focused on soil health. They've now just changed the whole system again, and there's a bit more of the same, and there's other new things coming this year which will be even better for the system that we use, for example. So they're obviously trying to incentivize people to think more regeneratively and go down that route. And at the end of the day, it's supported effectively by public money, and it's meant to be delivering public good, which it hopefully will, because their food will be produced more responsibly, arguably, in a hopefully overall a less polluting, more sustainable, more regenerative manner. And so, I'm happy that they're heading in that direction.
The last principle is to integrate animals into the system. Do you use animals on your farm? And if so, can you explain their role and benefits to soil health?
We only have a small involvement in animals. During those 2 years out of 6 where we have a cover crop, we have a neighbour who owns sheep who brings them in to graze off the cover crops. So that's how we terminate and finish the cover crop cycle. We have different options there. We could either kill the cover crops off with glyphosate, which is our least preferred option, or we can use sheep like we prefer to. So we like the fact that it's introducing an animal. They're coming in, they're bringing sort of different microbes with them, and they're processing the stuff. They're putting muck back on the ground, which is being incorporated into the soil. They don't eat all of it. They're trampling a lot of it in, which is again sort of introducing or incorporating some of that organic matter and plant fibre into the top of the soil. Arguably, we could have more, and it's something we're sort of constantly looking at. But so yes, who knows? We might go further down that route in the future.
What would be your advice for farmers listening to this podcast who might be interested in adopting more regenerative practices?
I would just emphasize the benefits that we've seen, really, which has been, I didn't really touch on it before, but we've seen quite big savings in time and therefore money, and diesel, wearing metal, because we're not using tillage anymore. It takes a bit more management input, and you mustn't underestimate that. You've got to be on the ball, not just that day, but really thinking ahead and making sure you've got that residue right, so it's not an embarrassment when you put the planter in the field and try and drill through it, and so on and so forth. But all of that together is very rewarding. So we haven't seen any yield penalty. All we've seen really is benefits by reducing the time involved and making savings on, therefore, on labour and also diesel. Our tractor hours are down. We use probably 60% of the diesel that we used to, for example. Best of all, though, I think, is probably in not I'm not saying we're getting better yields, but I think we're slightly more consistent than we used to be. And in those dry years, when we compare our yields to our near neighbours, we have a sort of discussion group. It just looks like our crops have held on a bit longer, and in those really tricky years, they're less affected than other people's crops are. And so that to me is very encouraging, because that was really the reason we set out down this route.
So in terms of productivity, you've not lost any, not really gained any, but you're more consistent. Is that what you're saying?
Productivity in terms of output.
Yes.
In terms of output, yes, it's probably pretty similar. Yeah,
pretty similar.
Yeah.
But in terms of profitability, with these extra sources of income from government funds and low input costs.
Yeah.
So has it improved the?
Yes, and certainly with the sort of new announcements that have been made, that'll definitely push us into a more profitable situation. I mean, prior to that, yes, we were better off because of that reduction in overhead costs. But this is just going to really enhance it. So there's nothing to lose really.
And a really important factor as well is resilience to climate change. Because as we know, you mentioned already a couple of times, the rainfall might be much more erratic now. Sometimes very heavy rainfall, sometimes longer periods of drought. And having this kind of system is more resilient.
Yeah.
But also resilience to future change in costs, because obviously if you're depending on fossil fuel, and also that chemical fertilizer is also very fossil fuel intensive. So have you seen these costs change a lot in recent times when we had a lot of political uncertainty in certain countries and conflict?
Hugely. I mean, there's been massive inflation on the back of well, I don't know. I suppose things started getting a bit exciting with COVID, globally, and then it was intensified more specifically on the back of the Russian-Ukraine upsets, causing nitrogen to more than double in price, and that really focuses the mind. So we're just coming out of a year where we paid a lot of money for fertilizer during that crop cycle, and the margins are not very clever. So it focuses the mind even more to think, well, how can we reduce these inputs, and how can we keep pushing to make sure the efficiency of their use is optimized, so that we can get away with putting less on, both from an economic point of view and from an environmental benefit point of view. So the less inputs we have to use, then the more self-sufficient and the more sustainable we're going to be. So it's it just sort of brings a more exciting element to crop production rather than just sort of going through the same processes each year.
That's what I find so encouraging and interesting about this whole regenerative movement or agroecological movement. There's different terms for it. It seems to be working quite well. It seems to me to be making farms more resistant, more resilient, less dependent on global markets. It seems to be a pretty interesting solution to protect our food systems in the coming decades.
I think so. Yes. Yeah. I'm happy that's the route we've gone down, and we'll hopefully keep. We've got a long way to go, and there's a lot of scope to keep improving, and that's where my focus will be.
I'd like to mention the sponsor of this podcast, Soil Capital. It's a company that helps farmers transition to more regenerative practices and get rewarded for their efforts through carbon payments. Andrew, you're part of the Soil Capital program. Could you explain how it works?
Sure. So we've been with Soil Capital for it's been about 3 years since we signed up with them. And so we were beginning to recognise that there's a demand for carbon, if you like, and we latched onto the fact that they're able to quantify purely on an annual basis those beneficial things that we're doing that effectively ensure we're not releasing as much carbon as a more conventional system. It very simply looks at what's going on in each field each year and making a calculation on what is held. So the courtesy of having a more diverse rotation nowadays, and courtesy of having some cover cropping, one of the big things is the fact that we're not using tillage anymore, so that's very helpful in the equation. Trying to reduce our nitrogen use, bringing in a little bit of organic matter in our system, that adds to the sums. And so ultimately, on average, over the last couple of years, they've calculated that we're sequestering about 2.5 tons of carbon per hectare. And that has a value to it because there's industries out there whose processes are the opposite, and they need to offset that. And so we're very happy to have this tie-up with Soil Capital, whereby they can accurately quantify and pay us for what we're sequestering, and their system of insetting and using it within in the industry sort of appeals, and hopefully it's a win-win for everyone.
I read on your website that technology plays an increasingly important role on your farm. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I suppose we're surrounded by technology, aren't we? And I guess the point where you could be totally bamboozled by all the different options out there. We're using GPS on the tractors to accurately and efficiently steer up and down the fields, sort of optimizing their efficiency and minimizing their time and diesel use, etc. We're using more and more like satellite imagery to capture biomass maps and therefore apply nutrients more specifically where they're needed. That same technology of the GPS is creating the yield map, so we can analyze fields far better, and we can just be more specific about how to manage areas within each field to optimize their output. And there's much more on the horizon. I mean, I mentioned the robotic weeding earlier, autonomous tractors, which will sort of perhaps alleviate a labor shortage, for example. Advances in all sorts of things, plant genetics, and we're just surrounded by innovation and opportunity. So there's a lot of exciting things for me, and I dare say, if my son comes into the industry, it'll be a very different picture even in 10 years' time to what it is now.
Do you think that by transitioning to this type of agriculture that takes care of the soil and ecosystem and brings in diversity, you're making the idea of taking over this farm more desirable?
I think so. Yes, there's more to it, which I think can only be positive and generate more interest. It's just more rewarding, and I suppose from a purely commercial point of view, I would suggest that a farm that is being managed regeneratively or in that kind of nature is going to increase in value more than a conventional farm. And if you can prove, for example, that your organic matter levels have gone from 2% to 6%, that just inherently means that ground is going to be more productive and more efficient at producing crops. And so the least I can do is hand over an asset which has those enhanced characteristics and enhanced potential and value. And hopefully they'll be keen to take it on and take it further.
What's the most important lesson you've learned from working with the land that you'd like to pass on to future generation? A bit more philosophical. I
think the biggest lesson is you're not in charge at all. Nature is in charge. And there was a period, when I was very young, I suppose, the second half of the last century, where it was just all about fighting it with artificial inputs and power and etc., where it worked for a bit, but I think it was to the detriment on the whole, and soil quality declined and problems occurred and such like. And so it's more, in my mind, it's more about just understanding your soil, understanding your farm or your garden or whatever, and not forcing it, sort of, listening to what nature's telling you and reacting accordingly, so that you're working more in harmony. And I think that's probably in the long term going to be far more rewarding. That's a beautiful way to see it. You're not in charge; nature is in charge, and your role is more to observe and listen to nature and try and help it along. Exactly. Rather than force it in directions that it doesn't want to go in. Yeah. What's the most common misconception about regenerative agriculture you encounter, and how do you respond to it? One thing you hear a lot is it won't work on my soil. I don't pretend that we don't have the trickiest soils. We've probably had a pretty reliable starting point to go down this route. But the harder you research it, and I did quite a lot of research before we started, there are very good cases in a whole range of soil types, a whole range of rainfall extremes, and people can make it work. So, if it's not working on a heavy soil, it's perhaps because it isn't adequately drained, and you're overlooking, one of the fundamentals of farming, I suppose. So, it's easy to make excuses, but quite often they can be overcome, and hopefully shouldn't hold people back.
Andrew, this has been a really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for your time and for having me here at Hyde Farm.
It's been a pleasure. No, thank you. Thank you for talking to me.